At the family dinner, my mother-in-law Grace smirked. Too bad Marianne can't seem to hold down a real job like the rest of us. My husband Marco laughed. Maybe she should stop pretending to be a businesswoman. Everyone joined in the laughter. I just smiled, stood up and placed a folder on the table. Since we're discussing my career, let me show you exactly what kind of businesswoman I really am. The room went dead silent as Marco's face drained of all color. The autumn evening air carried the scent of roasted turkey and simmering cranberry sauce through the Blackstone family estate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A sprawling colonial mansion that had housed 4 generations of successful attorneys and judges. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany furniture that cost more than most people's cars, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from walls lined with first-edition law books. This was old money, established power, and generational prestige, everything I had married into 3 years ago when I said yes to Marco Blackstone. Tonight was supposed to be special. Not just another monthly family dinner, but a celebration of Marco's recent promotion to senior partner at his father's prestigious law firm Blackstone & Associates. I had spent 2 weeks planning every detail, coordinating with their housekeeper Mrs. Helena to ensure the meal would be perfect. The imported wine from Marco's favorite vineyard in Tuscany, the hand-selected flowers arranged in grandmother Blackstone's antique vases, even the playlist of classical music that his mother Grace preferred during formal dinner. I'd driven to 3 different specialty stores to find the exact herbs for the turkey rub that had been passed down through Marco's family for generations. Every napkin was pressed to perfection, every piece of silverware polished until it gleamed. The dining room looked like something from Architectural Digest, which was exactly what I'd been aiming for. After 3 years of marriage, I was still desperately trying to prove I belonged in this world of inherited wealth and social expectation. The guest list read like a who's who of the city's legal elite. Marco's parents, Judge Anthony Blackstone and his wife Grace, a woman who sat on the boards of 3 major charities and had never worked a day in her life. His younger sister Emmy, fresh from her Harvard law degree and already making waves at the district attorney's office. His older brother Seth, a federal prosecutor who'd never met a conversation he couldn't turn into a lecture about constitutional law. Their spouses, all carefully selected from the same social circle, all speaking the same language of private schools and country club memberships. And then there was Marianne Foster, now Marianne Blackstone, the girl from the middle-class suburb who'd met Marco during his brief rebellious phase in graduate school. The one who didn't come with a trust fund or a family name that opened doors. The one who'd been working various jobs since college, trying to build something of my own while navigating the treacherous waters of upper-class expectation. Grace Blackstone had never quite forgiven her son for marrying beneath his station, though she was far too sophisticated to say so directly. Instead, she deployed a more subtle arsenal of condescension and passive aggression, each comment carefully crafted to remind me that I would always be an outsider looking in. "Marianne, dear," she would say with that perfectly practiced smile, "it's so charming how you insist on working these little jobs, like playing house, isn't it?" The little jobs she referred to with such dismissive affection were my attempts to build a consulting business. For the past 2 years I'd been helping small companies streamline their operations and improve their efficiency. It wasn't glamorous work, and it certainly didn't come with the prestige of a law degree from an Ivy League school. But it was mine. I'd built every client relationship from scratch, learned every aspect of business operations, through trial and error, and slowly begun to see real success. But to the Blackstone family, anything that wasn't law, medicine, or inherited wealth was merely a hobby, a way to pass time until I came to my senses and settled into the role of a proper society wife, hosting charity luncheons and organizing fundraising galas. Marco had been different when we first met. He'd seemed genuinely interested in my ambitions, impressed by my work ethic and determination to create something of my own. During our courtship, he'd often talked about how refreshing it was to be with someone who understood the value of hard work, someone who wasn't just coasting on family connections. But marriage had a way of revealing true priorities, and the pressure from his family had been relentless. Subtle at first comments about how demanding my work schedule was, questions about when I'd have time for children if I kept playing entrepreneur, then more direct suggestions that I join Grace's charity committees instead. Hints that Marco's career would benefit from having a wife who could focus full-time on being the perfect corporate spouse. Tonight, as I surveyed the perfect table setting and listened to the sounds of the family gathering in the living room, I felt the familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. These dinners were always a performance, a careful dance where I tried to prove my worth while they politely but persistently reminded me of my place. I could hear Emmy's voice carrying from the next room, regaling everyone with stories from the DA's office. She was the golden child, brilliant and ambitious, everything a Blackstone daughter should be. Seth was probably pontificating about some recent Supreme Court decision, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been questioned. And Marco would be basking in the attention, celebrating his promotion while gradually distancing himself from the wife who didn't quite fit the image of success he was cultivating. What none of them knew, what I had been carefully keeping to myself for months, was that my little consulting business had grown far beyond their dismissive expectations. The contracts I'd been working on, the late nights they assumed were just me playing businesswoman, had been building towards something significant, something that would change not just my life, but potentially all of theirs. Hidden in my home office, locked in a fireproof safe that Marco didn't even know existed, were documents that told a very different story about Marianne Blackstone than the one his family had constructed. Financial records, client contracts, and legal papers that revealed exactly what kind of businesswoman I really was. But as I smoothed my black dress and checked my reflection one last time before joining them for dinner, I had no idea that tonight would be the night everything came crashing down. I didn't know that Grace's cruelty would reach new heights, that Marco would choose his family's approval over his wife's dignity, or that I would finally be pushed past the point of polite tolerance. I certainly didn't know that by the end of the evening, the carefully constructed hierarchy of the Blackstone family would be turned completely upside down, and that the little wife with her little business would be revealed as something far more powerful than any of them had ever imagined. The dinner service itself was a masterpiece of coordination that would have impressed the staff at the city's finest restaurants. I had worked with Miss Led for weeks to perfect the timing, ensuring that each course would be served at precisely the right temperature and at exactly the right moment. The appetizer course featured delicate crab cakes with a remoulade sauce made from scratch, paired with a crisp Sauvignon Blanc that Anthony had brought up from the wine cellar, a bottle that cost more than most people's monthly rent. As the family took their seats around the enormous dining table, I felt the familiar flutter of nervous energy that accompanied these gatherings. The seating arrangement alone had required careful consideration. Grace, of course, took her position at the head of the table opposite her husband, a queen surveying her domain. Marco sat to her right, in the place of honor befitting the evening's guest of honor. Emmy was positioned where she could easily dominate the conversation, while Seth and his wife Harriet flanked the other side of the table. I had been assigned the seat furthest from Grace, next to Marco, but clearly marking my position as the most junior member of the family hierarchy. It was a subtle but unmistakable reminder of where I stood in the Blackstone pecking order, and I was certain Grace had orchestrated it deliberately. The conversation began, as it always did, with updates on various professional achievements and social obligation. Anthony regaled the table with stories from his recent conference of federal judges, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his every word treated as wisdom. Emmy shared news of a high-profile case she was prosecuting, her Harvard education evident in every precisely chosen word and legal reference. Seth, not to be outdone by his younger sister, launched into a detailed analysis of recent Supreme Court decisions that might affect his upcoming federal cases. His wife Harriet, a pediatric surgeon at the city's most prestigious hospital, contributed stories from her practice that somehow managed to sound both compassionate and supremely accomplished. And then there was Marco, practically glowing with pride as he described his new role as senior partner. The family hung on his every word as he outlined his plans for expanding the firm's corporate division, bringing in higher-profile clients, and cementing the Blackstone name as the most respected legal brand in the state. Throughout these performances of success and status, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I sat quietly, offering appropriate congratulations and asking the right question. I had learned over 3 years of marriage that these dinners were not conversations but rather presentations, each family member taking their turn to demonstrate their worthiness of the Blackstone name. When attention occasionally turned to me, the questions were always the same. "How's your little business going, dear?" Or "Still enjoying your consulting work?" The words were polite enough, but the underlying message was clear. What I did was inconsequential, a hobby to fill time until I embraced my true role as Marco's supporting cast member. What they didn't know, what I had been carefully concealing for months, was that my little business had grown exponentially beyond anything they could imagine. While they saw me leaving the house for what they assumed were small-time meetings with struggling local companies, I was actually building relationships with major corporations across the region. The late nights they attributed to my stubborn refusal to accept help were actually spent finalizing contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The phone calls I took in my home office, the ones that made Grace roll her eyes and sigh about my inability to disconnect from work, were negotiations with Fortune 500 companies, seeking my expertise in operational efficiency. For 6 months, I had been secretly developing a revolutionary software system that could streamline corporate operations in ways that traditional consulting had never achieved. The prototype had been tested by 3 major companies, and the results had been so impressive that I was fielding calls from competitors trying to poach me before my system even launched officially. But I had said nothing to Marco or his family. Part of it was self-protection. I had learned that sharing my successes with the Blackstones only resulted in them finding ways to diminish or dismiss my achievements. But another part of it was strategic. I was building something that would make it impossible for them to continue treating me as the charity case who had somehow tricked their golden boy into marriage. As I watched them perform their evening ritual of intellectual superiority and professional one-upmanship, I felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness. These people had welcomed me into their family, but only on the condition that I remain forever grateful and forever less. They had given me their name, their social connections, and access to their rarefied world, but they had never given me their respect. Tonight I had planned to finally share my news. The contracts were signed, the software was ready for launch, and the financial projections were beyond anything I had dared to hope for when I started this journey. I had imagined Marco's proud smile when he learned that his wife wasn't just surviving in the business world, but actually thriving beyond his family's wildest expectations. I had pictured Grace's surprise, hopefully followed by a genuine acknowledgement of my capabilities. I had even allowed myself to hope that this might be the night when I finally stopped being the outsider and became a true member of the family. But as the evening progressed and the familiar patterns of condescension and casual dismissal continued, I began to realize that my hopes had been naive. The Blackstones weren't interested in seeing me succeed. They were invested in maintaining the hierarchy that kept them comfortable and superior. The revelation, when it came, would not be the celebration I had imagined. Instead, it would become something far more dramatic and permanently life-changing than any of us could have predicted. The transformation in Grace's demeanor was subtle at first, like the way storm clouds gather on a distant horizon before unleashing their fury. Throughout the appetizer course, she had maintained her practiced veneer of polite interest, asking the appropriate questions and making the expected comments. But I had been watching her carefully for 3 years, and I could read the signs that others missed. The slight tightening around her eyes when someone praised my cooking. The way her smile never quite reached her pupils when she looked in my direction. Grace Blackstone was a woman who had built her entire identity around being the undisputed matriarch of a successful legal dynasty. At 62, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that money could buy and maintain. Perfectly styled silver hair that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Flawless skin maintained by the city's most exclusive dermatologist, and a wardrobe that spoke of generations of wealth and impeccable taste. But beneath the polished exterior was a woman who had never forgiven fate for giving her what she considered an unsuitable daughter-in-law. Grace had spent Marco's entire adult life carefully curating a list of potential wives, daughters of judges, heiresses to old money families, women from their social circle who understood without explanation what it meant to be a Blackstone bride. And then Marco had brought home A girl from a suburban middle-class family where my father fixed cars for a living and my mother taught elementary school. A girl who shopped at department stores instead of boutiques, who had never set foot in a country club until I started dating her son, who had the audacity to want a career instead of simply basking in the reflected glory of the Blackstone name. The first crack in Grace's facade appeared during the main course, when Anthony made an offhand comment about how impressed he was with the meal's coordination. "Marianne has quite a talent for organization," he said, reaching for another helping of the herb-crusted lamb. "This rivals anything we've had at the country club." For a brief moment, I felt a surge of hope. Perhaps tonight would be different. Perhaps Grace would finally acknowledge that I brought value to their family beyond simply being Marco's wife. But Grace's response was swift and cutting. "Oh, Anthony, you're so sweet," she said with a laugh that sounded like crystal breaking. "Though I suppose when you have nothing but time on your hands, it's easier to focus on domestic pursuits." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just been lit. "Nothing but time on your hands." The implication was clear. I was unemployed, idle, a woman of leisure who could afford to spend weeks planning dinner parties because I had no real responsibilities or meaningful work to occupy my time. Emmy, sensing the shift in her mother's mood, decided to pile on. "Speaking of careers," she said, her voice carrying the particular brand of condescension that only a Harvard law graduate could perfect. "How's the consulting business going, Mary? Still helping those little companies with their, what do you call it, efficiency problems?" The way she said little companies made it sound like I was running a lemonade stand. The pause before efficiency problems suggested that she couldn't quite understand what such a thing might involve, as if the concept of operational improvement was too abstract for someone of her intellectual caliber to grasp. But it was Grace who delivered the killing blow with surgical precision. She set down her wine glass and fixed me with that smile I had come to dread, the one that preceded her most devastating observation. "You know, Marianne," she began, her voice carrying the tone of someone about to share wisdom with a particularly slow child, "I've been thinking about your situation. Here you are, 3 years into marriage, still clinging to these little hobbies instead of embracing your role as Marco's wife." She paused, allowing her words to settle like poison in the bloodstream. Around the table, conversations gradually died as everyone sensed that Grace was building towards something significant. "I mean, it's admirable in a way," she continued, tilting her head as if considering a mildly interesting specimen in a laboratory. "This determination to play businesswoman instead of accepting that you've already achieved the greatest success any woman could hope for, marrying into one of the city's most respected families." The word play hit like a physical blow. 3 years of late nights, client meetings, contract negotiations, and genuine business growth, reduced to playing pretend. My software development, my Fortune 500 clients, my revolutionary efficiency algorithms, all of it dismissed as make-believe. "Grace," Anthony began, clearly uncomfortable with his wife's increasingly cruel tone, but she held up a perfectly manicured hand to silence him. "No, Anthony, this needs to be said. Someone has to help Marianne understand reality." Her eyes never left my face as she spoke, studying my reaction like a scientist observing a test subject. "These little consulting jobs, this stubborn insistence on having a career," she made air quotes around the word, "it's really just a way of avoiding the responsibilities that come with being part of this family." Seth shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Harriet suddenly became fascinated with her dinner plate. Even Emmy looked slightly taken aback by her mother's direct assault, but Grace was just getting started. "The truth is, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "you're holding Marco back. Do you know how many partners' wives sit on important charity boards? How many of them host the kind of social events that bring in major clients? While you're off playing with spreadsheets and pretending to run a business, Marco's career is suffering because his wife can't be bothered to fulfill her actual duties." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Missy Helena, who had been quietly clearing dishes in the background, froze in place as if afraid to make any sound that might draw Grace's attention. Marco sat beside me, and I could feel the weight of his silence like a stone in my chest. This was his moment. This was when my husband should defend me, should tell his mother that her attack was inappropriate and cruel, should stand up for the woman he had promised to honor and protect. Instead, I watched his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on his wine glass, as if it contained the answers to the universe. The man who could argue complex legal cases in front of federal judges was apparently struck mute when faced with defending his wife against his mother's cruelty. Grace smiled, recognizing victory in her son's silence. She had successfully reminded everyone at the table of the hierarchy, re-established the boundaries, and put the upstart daughter-in-law firmly back in her place. What she didn't know was that she had just lit the fuse on a bomb that would destroy everything she thought she understood about power, success, and exactly who held the real authority in this family. The moment stretched like a taut wire about to snap. Grace's words hung in the air between us, waiting for anyone to respond. My heart hammered against my ribs as I turned to look at Marco, my husband, my supposed partner in life, the man who had sworn before God and witnesses to stand by me through everything. Marco Blackstone had never looked more like his mother's son than he did in that moment. The same patrician features, the same calculated expression, the same cold assessment of social advantage that I had somehow convinced myself he didn't possess. 3 years of marriage, and I was finally seeing him clearly. He cleared his throat, a nervous sound that I recognized as his tell when he was about to say something he knew would hurt me. In courtrooms, that little throat clearing meant he was about to deliver a blow that would devastate the opposing counsel's case. At home, it meant I was about to discover another way that I had failed to meet the Blackstone family standard. "You know," he said, his voice carrying that careful, measured tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while saying something completely unreasonable. "Mother does have a point, Marianne." The betrayal was immediate and complete, not because of what he said, but because of what he chose not to say. He didn't defend me. He didn't defend my work. He didn't tell his mother that her attack was inappropriate, cruel, or completely out of line. Instead, he joined her. Marco continued, warming to his theme as he saw the approval in his mother's eyes. "We've been married 3 years now, and you're still acting like you're single, still prioritizing these consulting projects over our family obligations. Family obligation. As if my crime was refusing to become a decorative accessory to his legal career." "Marco," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "What exactly are you saying?" He looked directly at me for the first time since Grace's assault began, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. It wasn't anger or frustration or even disappointment. It was embarrassment. He was embarrassed by me. "I'm saying that maybe it's time to be realistic about your priorities," he said, and there was a note of condescension in his voice that I had never heard directed at me before. "You're a Blackstone now. That comes with certain expectations, certain responsibility. And frankly, this stubborn insistence on playing entrepreneur is starting to reflect poorly on the family." Playing entrepreneur. He had used almost the exact same phrase as his mother. Either he had been discussing my situation with Grace behind my back, or the family's disdain for my work was so unanimous that they all instinctively reached for the same dismissive language. Emmy leaned forward, clearly emboldened by her brother's betrayal. "Plus, Marianne, it's not like your little business is actually successful," she said with the casual cruelty that seemed to run in the Blackstone bloodline. If it were really taking off, you'd be able to afford to hire help instead of spending all your time on these tiny projects." Seth nodded sagely, apparently deciding that this was an appropriate moment for one of his lectures. "There's a difference between having a hobby and having a career," he said, his federal prosecutor voice in full effect. "And from what we can see, your consulting work falls pretty definitively into the hobby category." I looked around the table, taking in each face, cataloging every expression of smug superiority and casual dismissal. These people who had welcomed me into their family with such careful politeness, who had smiled at our wedding and toasted our happiness, who had spent 3 years slowly and systematically undermining my confidence and my sense of self-worth. But it was Marco's betrayal that cut deepest. Marco, who had seen me work until midnight preparing client presentations. Marco, who had listened to me talk excitedly about breakthrough solutions and successful implementations. Marco, who knew exactly how hard I worked and how much my business meant to me. Marco, who was now looking at me with the same expression of patient disappointment that a parent might use with a child who refused to put away their toys. "Look, sweetheart, he said, and the endearment sounded like an insult in this context. Nobody's saying you can't have interest, but there's a difference between having interests and neglecting your real responsibility. Real responsibilities. As if everything I had built, every client relationship I had nurtured, every innovation I had developed was just a distraction from my true purpose as Mrs. Marco Blackstone. What real responsibilities? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Grace smiled triumphantly, sensing that we were finally getting to the heart of the matter. Well, for starters, you could join the hospital auxiliary board. Margaret Worthington has been asking about you for months, and there's the Children's Literacy Foundation. They're always looking for dedicated volunteers. Volunteer work, Marco added, as if this was the most reasonable suggestion in the world. Something that would actually benefit the community, instead of just feeding your ego. Feeding my ego. 3 years of building a business that was revolutionizing corporate efficiency, reduced to ego gratification. And of course, Grace continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. There's the matter of children. You've been married 3 years now. Marianne, don't you think it's time to start thinking about giving Marco the family he deserves? The family he deserves, as if I were somehow withholding children out of spite, rather than building a career that could support a family better than any trust fund. Anthony, who had been increasingly uncomfortable throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke up. Perhaps we should change the subject, he suggested weakly. But Grace wasn't finished. No, Anthony, this is important. Someone needs to help Marianne understand what it means to be part of this family. We've been patient, we've been supportive, but this selfishness has gone on long enough. Selfishness. Building a business was selfish, creating jobs was selfish, developing technology that helped companies operate more efficiently was selfish. But sitting on charity boards and hosting cocktail parties, that was virtuous. Marco reached over and placed his hand on mine, a gesture that might have looked supportive to an outside observer, but felt like a shackle. We just want you to be happy, Marianne, he said, and we can see that all this stress from trying to run a business is wearing you down. Wouldn't it be easier to just let it go? Let it go. 3 years of work, innovation, and success, just let it go. I looked at my husband's face, searching for any sign of the man I had fallen in love with, the man who had once said he admired my ambition and determination. But all I saw was a Blackstone, born and bred, someone who had never questioned the idea that success for women meant marrying well and supporting their husbands' careers. The silence stretched between us as I realized that this wasn't just about tonight's dinner conversation. This was about the fundamental incompatibility between who I was and who they needed me to be. They didn't want me to succeed. They wanted me to disappear into the role of dutiful wife and eventually dutiful mother, a supporting character in Marco's story rather than the protagonist of my own. What none of them knew was that in about 10 minutes, I was going to show them exactly what kind of protagonist I really was. What happened next was like watching a feeding frenzy. Once Marco had given his family permission to attack me by joining in himself, the floodgates opened. The careful veneer of polite society that the Blackstones prided themselves on maintaining crumbled away, revealing the ugly truth beneath their refined exteriors. Harriet, who had been silent throughout most of the evening, suddenly found her voice. As a pediatric surgeon, she was used to being the voice of authority in a room full of people, and she wielded that authority now like a scalpel. You know, Marianne, she said, her tone carrying the condescending patience she probably used with the parents of her young patients. From a medical perspective, this obsession with career achievement at the expense of family planning is actually quite concerning. She paused to take a sip of wine, letting her words sink in before continuing her diagnosis. Women who delay childbearing for career reasons often struggle with fertility issues later, and the stress of trying to manage a business, especially one that's clearly not generating significant income, can be incredibly damaging to reproductive health. The clinical detachment in her voice made it even more insulting. She was discussing my life choices, as if I were a case study rather than a person sitting right across from her. Plus, she added, warming to her medical lecture, there's the psychological impact to consider. This desperate need to prove yourself professionally suggests some underlying insecurity issues that really should be addressed before you bring children into the world. Seth nodded approvingly at his wife's assessment, then decided to add his own legal perspective to the psychological evaluation they were conducting without my consent. From what I've observed, he said, using the same authoritative tone he employed when addressing juries, Marianne's behavior shows all the classic signs of someone who refuses to accept reality. She's clinging to this fantasy of business success because she can't face the truth about her actual capabilities. He gestured with his wine glass as if presenting evidence to a court. Look at the facts. 3 years of this so-called consulting business. And what does she have to show for it? She's still working out of a home office, still taking meetings at coffee shops, still scrambling for clients. If this were a real business with real potential, there would be actual evidence of success. Emmy leaned forward eagerly, ready to pile on with her own analysis. Exactly. I mean, I've been practicing law for less than 2 years and I already have my own office, a support staff, major cases. That's what real professional success looks like. She looked at me with the pitying expression of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. Maybe the problem is that you're trying to compete in a world you don't really understand. Business is complicated, Marianne. It requires education, connections, and frankly a level of sophistication that not everyone possesses. The implication was crystal clear. I was too stupid, too poorly educated, and too low class to succeed in the business world. I should accept my limitations and be grateful for what I have. Anthony shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but his discomfort seemed to stem more from the crudeness of the attack than from any desire to defend me. When he finally spoke, it was in the tone of a judge delivering a reluctant but necessary verdict. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should consider that different people have different strengths. Marianne, your talents might be better suited to other pursuits. He couldn't even bring himself to say what those pursuits might be, but we all knew he meant the traditional female roles that Grace had been promoting all evening. But it was Mrs. Helena's reaction that stung almost as much as the family's attacks. Our housekeeper had been moving quietly around the dining room, clearing dishes and pretending not to listen to the conversation. But I caught her expression when she thought no one was looking. A mixture of pity and secondhand embarrassment that made my cheeks burn with shame. Even the hired help felt sorry for me. Grace, sensing that the moment was ripe for delivering the final blow, stood up slowly and walked around the table until she was standing directly behind my chair. She placed her hands on my shoulders in what might have looked like a maternal gesture to an outside observer, but felt like the grip of a predator about to strike. "Darling," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we're only having this conversation because we care about you. We can see how this stubborn insistence on playing businesswoman is destroying you from the inside." Her fingers tightened slightly on my shoulders, just enough to remind me who held the power in this room. "Look at yourself," she continued, 31 years old, married to a successful attorney from one of the city's most respected families, and instead of embracing the wonderful life you've been given, you're running around pretending to be something you're not. She leaned down until her mouth was close to my ear, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more menacing than if she had been shouting. "It's embarrassing, Marianne. For you, for Marco, for all of us. People are starting to talk. They're wondering why Marco's wife needs to work, whether the family is having financial problems, whether you're perhaps not quite as stable as we thought when we welcomed you into this family." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. "Continue down this path, and they would make me a social pariah. They would use their connections, their influence, and their reputation to destroy mine. So here's what's going to happen." Grace, straightening up and returning to her seat with the satisfied air of someone who had just solved a complex problem. "You're going to wind down this little consulting hobby of yours. You're going to join the hospital auxiliary board like a proper partner's wife. And you're going to start thinking seriously about starting a family." She smiled at me across the table, the same smile she might have used when discussing the weather or complimenting someone's dress. "Because the alternative," she said, her voice light and conversational, "is that you'll find yourself very lonely indeed. And I think we both know that a woman like you can't afford to be lonely." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for my response, waiting to see if I would accept their verdict and submit to their will. They expected tears, they expected protest, they expected me to beg for their approval, and promise to be a better daughter-in-law, a more compliant wife, a more grateful recipient of their family's generosity. What they didn't expect was the smile that slowly spread across my face as I stood up from the table. "Excuse me for just a moment," I said politely. "I need to get something from my office." As I walked toward my home office, leaving behind the dining room full of people who thought they had just delivered my professional death sentence, my mind wasn't on contracts or financial statements, or even the devastating revelation I was about to unleash. Instead, I found myself thinking about my younger sister Rachel. Rachel was 26, fresh out of graduate school, and currently working as a marketing coordinator for a small nonprofit organization. She made barely enough to cover her rent in a studio apartment across town, but she had something that the Blackstones, with all their wealth and influence, couldn't buy: the unwavering belief that I was capable of anything I set my mind to. Every Sunday morning, Rachel would call me with updates about her week, her dating life, her career aspirations. But invariably the conversation would turn to my business. "How's the consulting empire coming along?" she would ask, and there was never a trace of irony in her voice. To Rachel, it wasn't a question of whether I would succeed, it was simply a matter of when. She had been the one to drive me to my first major client presentation 2 years ago, sitting in the parking lot for 3 hours while I met with the executives of Morrison Industries. When I emerged with a signed contract worth $50,000, she had screamed so loudly that security came over to check if everything was okay. "That's my sister," she had announced to anyone within earshot. "She just landed her biggest client ever." Rachel didn't care that I worked from a home office, or that I sometimes took meetings at coffee shops. She saw potential where others saw limitation, vision where others saw foolishness. When Grace made her cutting remarks about my little hobbies, when Marco joined in with his talk about playing entrepreneur, when the entire family dismissed 3 years of genuine achievement as childish make-believe, they weren't just attacking me. They were attacking the future that Rachel believed in so completely. They were dismissing the dreams that my little sister talked about with such pride to her friends and coworkers. They were diminishing something that represented hope and possibility, and the belief that hard work could actually lead somewhere meaningful. But Rachel wasn't the only innocent victim of tonight's assault. As I unlocked my office door and stepped into the space that had become my sanctuary over the past 3 years, I thought about my clients, real companies with real problems that I had helped solve with real solutions. There was Jennifer Martinez, the owner of a small logistics company, who had been on the verge of bankruptcy when she hired me 18 months ago. Together we had streamlined her operations, reduced her overhead by 30%, and increased her efficiency to the point where she was now considering expanding to a second location. "You saved my business," she had told me just last month, tears in her eyes as she handed me a bonus check. "More than that, you saved my employees' jobs. You saved their families." There was David Park, the CEO of a mid-sized manufacturing firm, who had been hemorrhaging money due to outdated processes and communication breakdown. The software system I had developed specifically for his company had revolutionized their operations, increasing productivity by 40%, while simultaneously improving worker satisfaction. "I've never seen anything like it," he had said during our last quarterly review. "You didn't just fix our problems, you transformed our entire corporate culture." These weren't the little companies with efficiency problems that Emmy had dismissed so casually. These were businesses that employed hundreds of people, supported families, contributed to the local economy. When the Blackstones mocked my work, they were mocking the livelihoods of people they had never met and would never care about. But perhaps the most innocent victim of all was the version of myself that had walked into this marriage 3 years ago, full of hope and determination to prove that love could bridge any gap between social classes. The young woman who had believed that if she just worked hard enough, achieved enough, contributed enough to the family's success, she would eventually earn their respect and acceptance. That woman had spent countless hours perfecting dinner menus and studying wine pairings, not because she enjoyed domestic arts, but because she thought it would help her fit in. She had attended charity galas and country club events, smiling through conversations about people and places she had never heard of, because she wanted to be the kind of wife that Marco could be proud of. She had absorbed Grace's subtle criticisms and Marco's gentle suggestions for improvement, because she believed that their guidance came from a place of love rather than control. She had internalized their dismissive comments about her career because she trusted that they had her best interests at heart. Tonight, in that dining room, I had watched that hopeful, trusting version of myself die a slow and painful death. The woman who had desperately wanted to belong, who had been willing to shrink herself to fit into their predetermined mold, who had mistaken tolerance for acceptance, she was gone. In her place stood someone harder, clearer, and infinitely more dangerous. Someone who understood that respect could not be earned through submission, that love without equality was just another form of ownership, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to accept treatment that diminished your worth. As I opened the safe and pulled out the folder that would change everything, I thought about all the innocent victims of the Blackstones' cruelty. Rachel, who believed in me, my clients, who depended on me, the woman I used to be, who had trusted that they were about to learn that some victims fight back. Standing in my office, holding the folder that contained my professional vindication, I was suddenly flooded with memories of all the subtle ways the Blackstones had been undermining me from the very beginning. Tonight's dinner wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a systematic campaign of psychological warfare that had been waged against me for 3 years. I remembered my first major client presentation, the one with Morrison Industries. I had spent weeks preparing, researching every aspect of their business model, developing a comprehensive proposal that would revolutionize their supply chain management. The night before the presentation, I had been practicing my pitch in the living room when Marco walked in. "Still working on that little project?" he had asked, settling into his leather armchair with a glass of bourbon. The word little had stung, but I had dismissed it as casual conversation. "It's actually a pretty significant opportunity," I had replied, continuing to organize my presentation materials. "If this goes well, it could lead to contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." Marco had chuckled, that same condescending sound I would hear again tonight at dinner. "Sweetheart, don't you think you're getting a bit ahead of yourself? These big companies have entire departments of consultants. What makes you think they need advice from someone working out of a home office?" Even then, before I had proven myself, before I had built my reputation, he was planting seeds of doubt, making me question my own capabilities, my own worth, my own potential for success. When I had landed that Morrison contract, $50,000 for the initial phase with potential for expansion, I had rushed home to share the news with my husband. I had expected celebration, pride, maybe even an apology for his earlier doubt. Instead, Marco had listened to my excited recap with the patient expression of someone humoring a child's fantasy. "That's nice, honey," he had said, "though I hope you read the contract carefully. Sometimes these smaller agreements have clauses that can be problematic." Smaller agreement, $50,000 dismissed as small change by a man whose family had never known what it meant to work for anything. The pattern had continued through every success, every milestone, every achievement. When I had developed my first proprietary software system, Marco had suggested I might be overcomplicating things. When I had been featured in a local business journal as one of the rising entrepreneurs to watch, he had mentioned that the publication was more of a local newsletter. Grace had been even more subtle in her sabotage. Her comments always came wrapped in concern, delivered with the kind of maternal authority that made them difficult to challenge directly. "Darling, you look so tired lately," she would say during family dinner. "All this stress from your little business ventures. I worry that you're pushing yourself too hard for something that may not even work out." Or I was talking to Margaret Worthington at the club, and she mentioned seeing you at that coffee shop on 5th Street, taking meetings. She was concerned that you might be having financial difficulties. I assured her that wasn't the case, but perhaps you should consider meeting clients somewhere more appropriate. The message was always the same. My work was embarrassing. My success was temporary. My ambitions were unseemly for a woman of my social position. They had spent 3 years systematically eroding my confidence, making me question whether my achievements were real or just lucky breaks that wouldn't last. I remembered the night I had received my biggest contract yet, a multi-year deal with Hartwell Corporation worth over $300,000. I had been so excited that I had called Marco at his office, something I rarely did during business hours. "Marco, you're not going to believe this," I had said, my voice barely containing my excitement. "Hartwell just signed a 3-year contract. It's huge, bigger than anything I've ever done." There had been a pause, and I could hear voices in the background of his office. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully modulated, professional. "That's interesting, Marianne. Look, I'm in the middle of something here. Can we discuss this at home?" Later that evening, when I had tried to share the details of the contract, Marco had seemed distracted, uninterested. 300,000 over 3 years, he had mused. "So, about 100,000 per year, minus your expenses, taxes. It's a decent side income, I suppose." Side income, the largest contract of my career, reduced to supplemental household money. But it wasn't just the financial dismissal that hurt. It was the way they had trained me to diminish my own accomplishments. I had started using their language, calling my business a little consulting practice, referring to major corporations as small companies, apologizing for the time my work required as if I were pursuing a selfish hobby rather than building a legitimate enterprise. They had convinced me that success was something that happened to other people, people from the right families with the right connections and the right educational pedigree, people like them. They had made me grateful for their tolerance of my ambitions, rather than proud of my achievements. Tonight, listening to Grace's ultimatum and Marco's betrayal, I had finally understood what they had been doing. This wasn't about my career interfering with family obligations, or my work being somehow insufficient. This was about control. This was about keeping me in a position where I needed them more than they needed me. They had miscalculated badly, because while they had been busy undermining my confidence, I had been busy building an empire. The transformation didn't happen gradually, it struck like lightning, illuminating everything in a single brilliant flash of understanding. Standing in my office, surrounded by the evidence of everything I had built while they systematically tried to tear me down, I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. The desperate, pleading woman who had been sitting at that dinner table just minutes ago was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized but instinctively trusted. For 3 years I had been playing their game by their rules. I had accepted their definitions of success, their measurements of worth, their judgments about what constituted appropriate behavior for a woman in my position. I had allowed them to make me small, to convince me that my achievements were somehow less meaningful because they didn't come with the right pedigree or the right connections. But tonight, something had crystallized with perfect, devastating clarity. I didn't need their approval. I thought about the conversation that had just transpired in the dining room, and instead of feeling humiliated, I felt a strange sense of liberation. Grace's threats about social isolation, Marco's embarrassment about my career, Emmy's condescending lectures about real success, all of it suddenly seemed like noise from a world I no longer wanted to be part of. They had revealed themselves completely tonight, stripped away the polite veneer and shown me exactly who they were when they thought I had no power to fight back. They were bullies, plain and simple, sophisticated, well-educated, socially prominent bullies, but bullies nonetheless, and I was done being their victim. The folder in my hands felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the power to obliterate every assumption they had made about me. But more than that, it represented something they could never understand, the satisfaction of earning something through merit rather than inheritance, the pride of building something from nothing, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your success is entirely your own. I had been hiding my achievements out of some misguided desire to fit into their world, to make them comfortable with my success by making it seem smaller than it was. I had been protecting their egos at the expense of my own truth. No more. I walked to my desk and opened the folder, spreading the contents across the mahogany surface that Marco had bought for me 2 years ago. Every successful businesswoman needs a proper workspace, he had said, and I had been grateful for the gesture. Now I realized it had been another subtle form of control, defining the parameters of my ambition by giving me a proper place to contain it. The documents told a story that would shatter every narrative the Blackstones had constructed about me. Financial statements showing revenue that dwarfed Marco's annual salary, client testimonials from Fortune 500 CEOs praising my innovative solutions, patents for 3 separate software systems that were revolutionizing operational efficiency across multiple industries, and the crown jewel, a letter of intent from Meridian Global Corporation, one of the largest consulting firms in the world, offering to acquire my company for $12 million. $12 million for the little hobby that Grace thought I should abandon to focus on charity work and childbearing. I had been sitting on this offer for 2 weeks, uncertain about whether to accept it. The money was life-changing, but the company I had built felt like more than just a financial asset. It was proof of my own capabilities, validation of everything I had worked for. Tonight had clarified that decision with perfect precision. I wasn't going to sell my company and disappear into the traditional role they had carved out for me. I was going to use it as a weapon. The clarity was intoxicating. For months I had been second-guessing myself, wondering if maybe they were right, maybe I was being selfish or unrealistic or somehow inadequate. I had internalized their doubts until they became my own, constantly questioning whether my success was real or just a series of lucky breaks. But standing in my office, looking at the concrete evidence of what I had accomplished, I understood that their opinion was not just wrong, it was irrelevant. They could dismiss me, mock me, threaten to isolate me socially, and none of it mattered because I had something they would never have: the knowledge that I had earned my place in the world, through my own effort. They had inherited their status, their wealth, their sense of superiority. Everything they were had been handed to them by previous generations of Blackstones, who had accumulated power and prestige. They had never built anything, never created anything, never proven themselves capable of succeeding without the safety net of family money and connections. I had started with nothing and built an empire, and tonight, I was going to show them exactly what that empire looked like. The woman who walked back toward that dining room was not the same one who had left it 10 minutes earlier. She moved with the confidence of someone who had just remembered her own power, the calm assurance of someone who held all the cards and was finally ready to play them. They thought they had cornered me, forced me to choose between their approval and my ambitions. They had no idea that I was about to present them with a third option, accepting that they had drastically underestimated the wrong woman. The decision to keep my true success hidden from the Blackstones hadn't been made overnight. It had evolved gradually, born from a combination of self-preservation and strategic thinking that I hadn't even fully recognized until tonight. As I carefully selected which documents to bring back to the dining room, I found myself remembering the exact moment when secrecy had transformed from protection into preparation. It had been 6 months ago, during a family barbecue at Anthony and Grace's estate. I had just signed the Hartwell Corporation contract, my biggest deal to date, and I was practically vibrating with excitement. The contract represented not just financial success, but validation that my innovative approach to operational efficiency was genuinely revolutionary. I had planned to share the news during dinner, imagining Marco's pride and perhaps even Grace's grudging acknowledgement that my work had value. But as I listened to the family's conversation that afternoon, something had stopped me cold. Emmy had been regaling everyone with stories about her latest case, a high-profile prosecution that had landed her on the front page of the legal section. The family hung on every word, asking detailed questions, offering congratulations, treating her success as a family victory. Then Seth had shared news about a federal appointment he was being considered for, and again the response was immediate and enthusiastic. Phone calls were made to celebrate, connections were discussed, strategies were planned to ensure his selection. When the conversation had turned to me, the tone had shifted completely. "And how's Marianne's little consulting business?" Grace had asked, the question delivered with the same energy one might use to inquire about a child's finger paint. I had started to mention the Hartwell deal, but something in their expressions, polite tolerance, mixed with barely concealed impatience, had made me scale back my announcement. "Oh, it's going well," I had said instead. "Just signed a new client yesterday." "That's nice, dear. Grace had responded, already turning her attention back to Seth's career prospects. That night, lying in bed next to Marco, I had made a decision that would prove to be the most strategic choice of my life. I would stop sharing my victories with people who were determined to diminish them. Instead, I would build my empire in silence, accumulating power and proof until the moment when revelation would have maximum impact. The next morning, I had opened a separate bank account that Marco didn't know about, not because I was planning to leave him, at least, not consciously, but because I needed a space where my success could exist without their commentary, their analysis, their subtle but persistent attempts to make it smaller than it was. I had started meeting with clients at my office across town, a professional space I had rented using the false name Marianne Foster Consulting rather than Blackstone Consulting. When Marco asked about my meetings, I mentioned coffee shops and home visits, allowing him to maintain his image of me as someone playing at business, rather than someone dominating it. The patents I had filed were registered under my maiden name. The industry awards I had won were displayed in my private office, not our home. The speaking engagements at major conferences were scheduled for days when Marco would be out of town, traveling for his own work. Piece by piece, I had constructed a parallel professional life that existed entirely outside the Blackstone sphere of influence, not because I was ashamed of my success, but because I had learned that sharing it with them was like feeding flowers to people who only saw weeds. The Meridian Global acquisition offer had been the culmination of this strategy. When their CEO, Patricia Daniels, had called me directly to discuss purchasing my company, I had been sitting in my secret office, surrounded by evidence of achievements that my own family had never even heard about. "Mrs. Foster," she had said, even she knew me by my professional name rather than my married one, "what you've built is extraordinary. Our analysis shows that your efficiency algorithms could revolutionize how Fortune 500 companies approach operational management. We're prepared to offer $12 million for complete acquisition, with an additional 5-year consulting contract that would net you another $8 million. $20 million total, for the hobby that Grace wanted me to abandon. I had asked for 2 weeks to consider the offer, not because I needed time to think about the money, but because I needed time to decide how to use this information. The offer itself was validation beyond anything I had dared to imagine, but it was also ammunition. Now standing in my office with Patricia Daniels' letter in my hands, I understood exactly why I had been building this secret arsenal. Not for the money, though that was certainly life-changing, not even for the professional recognition, though that was deeply satisfying. I had been building it for this moment. For the night when the Blackstones would finally reveal themselves completely, when they would push me past the breaking point and force me to choose between their approval and my self-respect. They had given me an ultimatum: abandon my career, or face social isolation. What they didn't know was that I was about to give them one of my own: accept me as an equal, or watch me walk away from their world entirely, taking my $12 million empire with me. The folder in my hands wasn't just documentation, it was revolution. Building my secret empire had required the same methodical precision that I brought to every client project, but with an additional layer of complexity. It had to be accomplished while living under the constant scrutiny of a family that believed they owned the right to know everything about my life. The first challenge had been establishing financial independence without triggering Marco's suspicion. As a lawyer, he was naturally detail-oriented about paperwork and documentation. Our joint checking account was something he monitored regularly, not out of distrust, but out of the kind of financial vigilance that came with being raised in a family where money was both power and responsibility. I had solved this problem by creating what I called financial layers. The first layer was completely transparent: small consulting fees that went into our joint account, amounts that seemed reasonable for someone playing at business. These payments came from legitimate clients, but they represented only a fraction of what those clients actually paid me. The larger payments were funneled through a business account I had established using my maiden name, at a bank across town where the Blackstones did their personal banking. When Marco occasionally asked about client payments, I could truthfully show him deposits without revealing their actual scope. The second challenge had been more complex: how to meet with major corporate clients without the Blackstones knowing about it. Marco's social circle was vast and interconnected. The city's business community was surprisingly small when you reached the executive level, and there was always a risk that someone would mention seeing me in the wrong place with the wrong people. I had addressed this by developing what I privately called the coffee shop strategy. For every major client meeting I had at a corporate headquarters, I would schedule a smaller, visible meeting at a different client, usually someone from a smaller company who fit the Blackstone's assumptions about my business level. These coffee shop meetings served multiple purposes. If Marco asked about my day, I could truthfully tell him about meeting with a client at the downtown cafe. If anyone from his social circle happened to see me, they would observe exactly what they expected. Marco's wife having an appropriate business meeting in an appropriately modest venue. Meanwhile, my real meetings were happening in executive boardrooms 40 floors above the coffee shops, where I was negotiating contracts worth more than most people made in a decade. The third challenge had been the most delicate: how to develop revolutionary technology without anyone noticing the massive amount of research and development work required. Software development isn't something you can do casually in your spare time. It requires sustained focus, substantial computing resources, and often round-the-clock testing period. I had solved this by establishing what appeared to be a home-based consulting practice, while actually operating a sophisticated technology development operation. My home office became the visible front for the business, equipped with the kind of basic setup that would satisfy casual observation. But my real work was happening at the professional office space I had rented under my maiden name. This facility was equipped with enterprise-level servers, multiple development workstations, and direct connections to client test environment. When I told Marco I was working late on a project, he assumed I was in my home office struggling with spreadsheets. In reality, I was often across town, managing complex software implementations for Fortune 500 companies. The patent applications had required particular care. Filing patents under my married name would have created public records that Marco or his family might eventually discover. But filing them under my maiden name created a paper trail that existed entirely outside their awareness. I had worked with a patent attorney who specialized in technology consulting, paying his fees from my secret business account. The 3 patents I had successfully filed, covering revolutionary approaches to supply chain optimization, workforce management algorithms, and predictive maintenance systems, represented intellectual property worth millions of dollars in licensing potential alone. Each patent application had required months of detailed documentation, prior art research, and technical specifications. The work had been exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. I was creating something genuinely innovative, something that would change how major corporations approached operational efficiency. The most challenging aspect of maintaining my double life had been the emotional cost. Living with such a massive secret had required constant vigilance. Every conversation with Marco was carefully monitored for potential contradictions. Every family gathering required performance art, playing the role of someone whose ambitions were smaller than they actually were. But perhaps the most difficult part had been the isolation. My greatest professional achievements, landing the Morrison contract, developing my first breakthrough algorithm, being approached by Meridian Global, had to be celebrated alone. There was no one, in my daily life, who understood the magnitude of what I was building. I had compensated for this isolation by developing relationships within the business community that the Blackstones knew nothing about. Industry conferences had become my sanctuary, places where I could be known and respected for my actual accomplishments, rather than diminished for my social position. It was at one of these conferences that I had met Patricia Daniels, the CEO of Meridian Global. She had attended my presentation on revolutionary approaches to corporate efficiency, and had been so impressed that she had approached me immediately afterward. "Miss Foster," she had said, "what you've presented here could transform how we think about operational consulting. I'd like to discuss acquisition possibilities." $12 million was her opening offer. Tonight, as I prepared to reveal this offer to my husband's family, I realized it was also my declaration of independence. The psychological toll of maintaining such an elaborate deception had been far greater than I had anticipated when I first decided to compartmentalize my success. What had started as a defensive mechanism, protecting my achievements from the Blackstone's diminishing commentary, had evolved into something much more complex and emotionally costly. Every morning for the past 6 months, I had woken up next to a man who believed he knew everything about my life, while I carried secrets that would fundamentally alter his understanding of who I was. The weight of that deception had become a physical presence in our bedroom, an invisible barrier that made even casual intimacy feel like performance art. Marco would ask about my day over dinner, and I would craft responses that were technically truthful but completely misleading. I had a great meeting with a client downtown. I would say, omitting the fact that the client was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company and the meeting had taken place in a 42nd floor executive boardroom, where we had discussed a 7-figure contract expansion. The most challenging moments had been when Marco would try to be supportive of what he perceived as my small-scale business struggles. He would offer advice about growing my client base, or suggest that I consider raising my rates for my consulting services. His well-intentioned guidance felt like unwitting condescension from someone who had no idea that my rates were already higher than his hourly billing as a senior partner. Even worse were the moments when he would try to comfort me during what he assumed were professional disappointment. When I had been unusually quiet one evening, he had reached over and squeezed my hand sympathetically. "Don't get discouraged about the consulting business, sweetheart," he had said. "These things take time to build. Maybe we should think about setting up some networking opportunities through the firm's client connections." I had smiled and thanked him for his support, while internally screaming at the irony. That very day, I had received confirmation that my efficiency software had exceeded performance projections at 3 major corporations, generating bonus payments that would net me more in a single quarter than his law firm partnership earned in a year. The isolation had been crushing. Success is meant to be shared, celebrated, acknowledged by the people who matter most in your life. Instead, my greatest professional triumphs had been experienced in solitude. When Meridian Global had first approached me about acquisition, I had sat in my secret office for 20 minutes after hanging up the phone, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened, and having no one to call who would understand its significance. I had started keeping a private journal, not for sentimental reasons, but as a way to document my achievements for myself. The entries read like dispatches from a parallel universe. March 15th. Hartwell Corporation expanded their contract by $200,000 after seeing the efficiency improvements from my software implementation. Their productivity increased by 34% in the first quarter alone. April 22nd. Patent approval came through for the predictive maintenance algorithm. The attorney says it could be worth millions in licensing deals. May 8th. Spoke at the International Conference on Operational Excellence. 3 CEOs approached me afterward about potential partnership. These moments of triumph, which should have been shared with champagne toasts and proud phone calls to family, had instead been recorded in a leather-bound notebook that I kept locked in my office safe, like classified documents from a life that officially didn't exist. The secrecy had also created an unexpected side effect. It had made me acutely aware of how differently the Blackstones treated information about success depending on who achieved it. When Emmy had won a significant case, the family had thrown an impromptu celebration dinner. When Seth had been mentioned in a legal journal, Grace had called everyone she knew to share the news. But when I had been featured as a rising entrepreneur in the business section of the city's newspaper, a small mention that mentioned only my most modest achievements, the article had been met with polite acknowledgement and quickly forgot. Grace had even commented that it was sweet that the local papers were supporting small businesses by featuring stories like mine. The cognitive dissonance had been staggering. I was living a double life where my public persona was systematically diminished while my private reality was expanding beyond anything I had imagined possible. The woman the Blackstones saw at family dinners was a carefully constructed character, someone whose ambitions and achievements had been scaled down to match their expectations. Meanwhile, the real me was attending board meetings, negotiating multi-million-dollar deals and being courted by some of the most powerful consulting firms in the world. I had become 2 completely different people, and the effort required to maintain that separation had been exhausting. But tonight, as I stood in my office holding the folder that would bridge those 2 worlds, I realized that the emotional cost had been worth it. The months of secrecy hadn't just protected my achievements from their dismissal, they had also protected my confidence from their systematic undermining. I had built my empire in silence, and now I was ready to let it speak. The walk back to the dining room felt like a procession toward destiny. Each step was measured, deliberate, weighted with the knowledge that I was about to detonate a bomb that would reshape every relationship in that room. The folder in my hands felt heavier than it should have, not because of the paper it contained, but because of the power it represented. As I approached the dining room doorway, I could hear the murmur of conversation that had resumed in my absence. They were probably discussing me, analyzing my reaction to their ultimatum, perhaps even taking bets on whether I would return in tears or with a resignation to their demands. The idea that I might return with a weapon capable of destroying their entire worldview had clearly never occurred to them. I paused just outside the doorway, invisible to the people inside but able to observe them in their natural state. Grace was gesticulating with her wine glass, no doubt holding court about the proper way to handle difficult daughters-in-law. Marco was nodding along with whatever wisdom she was dispensing, his earlier betrayal apparently sitting comfortably with his conscience. Emmy was checking her phone, probably already mentally composing the story she would tell her law school friends about her brother's wife's inevitable capitulation. Seth and Harriet were engaged in quiet conversation, their body language suggesting they were discussing the evening's drama with the detached interest of spectators at a particularly entertaining sporting event. Even Mrs. Helena seemed to have relaxed, moving about the room with the efficient calm of someone who had witnessed the natural order being restored. The strange disruption caused by the middle-class interloper had been addressed, and normal family hierarchy could resume. Anthony was the only one who looked genuinely uncomfortable, shifting in his chair and avoiding eye contact with the others. Of all the people in that room, he was the only one who seemed to understand that what had just transpired was fundamentally wrong, regardless of its social necessity. I took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway, my entrance causing an immediate shift in the room's energy. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the grandfather clock seemed to tick more quietly, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "I'm sorry to have kept you waiting," I said, my voice carrying a calmness that surprised even me. "I wanted to make sure I brought the right documentation." I moved to my seat at the table with the unhurried grace of someone who held all the cards and was finally ready to play them. The folder remained closed in my hands, its contents a mystery that was clearly making several people nervous. Grace recovered first, her social training kicking in to smooth over the awkwardness. "Of course, dear," she said with forced brightness. "We were just discussing the upcoming charity gala. I do hope you'll consider joining the planning committee once you've sorted out your priorities." The presumption in her voice was staggering. She was already planning my post-surrender social rehabilitation, mapping out the charity work that would replace my discredited business ambition. "Actually," I said, setting the folder on the table directly in front of me, "I wanted to address some misconceptions that seem to have developed about my work." Marco shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Marianne, I really think we should discuss this privately." "No," I interrupted, my voice carrying an authority that made him actually flinch. "You decided to make this a public conversation when you joined your family in mocking my career, so we'll finish it publicly." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Emmy's phone had disappeared, and she was leaning forward with the predatory attention of someone sensing blood in the water. Seth had abandoned his wine entirely, his prosecutor instincts alerting him that he was about to witness either a spectacular confession or an equally spectacular defense. Grace's smile had become fixed and artificial, like a mask that was slipping but couldn't be removed. "Darling, I think you may be overreacting to what was just friendly family conversation." "Friendly?" I repeated, opening the folder with deliberate precision. "Is that what we're calling it when you threaten to socially isolate me if I don't abandon my career? When you publicly humiliate me for having ambitions beyond hosting charity luncheons?" My fingers traced the edge of the first document, and I could see several pairs of eyes trying to read the text from across the table. The letterhead was visible but not decipherable from their distance, which was exactly what I wanted. "You've all spent the evening explaining to me what real success looks like," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You've made it very clear that my little consulting business is an embarrassment to this family's reputation." I looked around the table, making eye contact with each person in turn. So I think it's time you learned exactly what kind of businesswoman you've been trying to silence. The folder lay open before me like a promise of revelation, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage, I had the Blackstone family's complete and undivided attention. I lifted the first document from the folder with the careful precision of someone handling explosive material. The Meridian Global letterhead was now clearly visible to everyone at the table, its corporate logo and official formatting immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the business world. "This," I said, holding the letter so that everyone could see it clearly, "is a formal acquisition offer from Meridian Global Corporation." The reaction was immediate and electric. Seth's wine glass froze halfway to his lip. Emmy's eyes widened with the kind of shock that comes from having your fundamental assumptions about reality suddenly challenged. Even Grace's practiced composure cracked, her mouth falling slightly open as she processed what I had just said. But it was Marco's reaction that cut deepest. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked dangerously close to fear. This was not the woman he had married, not the struggling entrepreneur he had been condescendingly supporting, not the amateur businesswoman who needed his family's guidance to understand her place in the world. "Meridian Global," I continued, my voice carrying across the silent room like a bell, "has offered to purchase my consulting company for $12 million. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the ice settling in Anthony's whiskey glass 3 seats away. Grace's hand trembled slightly as she set down her wine, the crystal making a tiny chiming sound against the mahogany table that seemed unnaturally loud. $12 million, I repeated, letting the number hang in the air like smoke from a fire that had just consumed everything they thought they knew about me. "For the little hobby that you've all been so concerned about." Emmy was the first to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. That's not possible. Meridian Global is one of the largest consulting firms in the world. They don't acquire small business." I smiled, and for the first time all evening, it was a genuine expression of satisfaction rather than social politeness. "You're absolutely right, Emmy. They don't acquire small businesses. They acquire revolutionary companies that are disrupting their industry." I pulled out the next document, a financial statement that showed revenue figures that dwarfed anything the Blackstones had imagined possible. "These are my earnings for the past 18 months. As you can see, my little consulting practice has generated over $2 million in revenue." The numbers on the page seemed to glow under the chandelier light, each figure a devastating blow to the narrative they had constructed about my inadequacy. Marco leaned forward, squinting at the document as if he could somehow make the numbers smaller, through sheer force of will. "This has to be some kind of mistake," Grace said, her voice lacking its usual authority. $2 million? From a home-based business?" "Oh, I'm sorry," I said with mock concern. "Did I forget to mention that I don't actually work from home? I have a fully equipped office facility across town, complete with enterprise-level servers and direct connections to Fortune 500 client networks." I watched the blood drain from Marco's face as he realized the implications. Every late night I had supposedly spent working from my home office, every small client meeting I had mentioned over dinner, every casual reference to my modest business operations, all of it had been a carefully constructed fiction designed to protect my success from their systematic demolition. "You lied to us," he said, his voice hollow with shock and something that might have been hurt. "No," I corrected, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I protected my achievements from people who were determined to diminish them. There's a I pulled out the patent documentation, the pages bearing official government seals and technical specifications that clearly demonstrated the sophisticated nature of my work. "These are the 3 patents I hold for revolutionary approaches to operational efficiency. According to my intellectual property attorney, they're worth an estimated $5 million in licensing potential alone." Seth's prosecutor training seemed to kick in, his mind automatically trying to find flaws in the evidence before him. "Even if this is all legitimate," he said carefully, "it doesn't change the fact that you've been deceiving your own family for months." "My own family?" I repeated, looking around the table at the faces that had spent the evening systematically tearing down my confidence and threatening my independence. Is that what we're calling people who mock your achievements, dismiss your ambitions, and demand that you abandon your career to fit their social expectations? The truth was spreading across the table like spilled wine, staining everything it touched. The documents I continued to produce painted a picture of success so far beyond their assumptions that they seemed to be struggling with the basic mechanics of processing the information. Client testimonials from CEOs of major corporations, industry awards for innovation, speaking engagements at international conferences, each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of their condescending certainty about my limitations. "You've all spent 3 years treating me like a charity case," I said, my voice rising with years of accumulated frustration, like some unfortunate social obligation that Marco had imposed on the family. "Well, here's the truth you've been so determined to avoid. I don't need your money. I don't need your connections. And I certainly don't need your approval." The aftermath of my revelation was like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. The carefully constructed hierarchy of the Blackstone family was crumbling before my eyes, and each member was scrambling to find stable ground in a world where their assumptions had just been proven catastrophically wrong. Anthony was the first to attempt damage control, his judicial training kicking in with the kind of measured response that had served him well on the bench for decades. He cleared his throat with the authority of someone accustomed to restoring order to chaotic courtrooms. "Marianne," he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a judge addressing both parties in a complex case, "this is quite remarkable. Clearly, we've all significantly underestimated the scope of your achievement." His words were diplomatic, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was already mentally recalibrating the family dynamics, adjusting his treatment of me to match this new information about my actual status and power. Grace, however, was not ready to surrender her position as family matriarch without a fight. Her recovery was swift and strategic, employing the kind of social maneuvering that had made her a formidable force in the city's charity circuit for decades. "Well, this is certainly a surprise," she said, her voice regaining some of its earlier authority. "Though I have to say, darling, it's rather unfortunate that you felt the need to be so secretive about your success. We could have been so much more supportive if we had understood the true nature of your work." The audacity was breathtaking. Within minutes of learning that she had been systematically undermining a multi-millionaire, Grace was already rewriting history to position herself as a supportive mother-in-law who had simply been misled by incomplete information. "Supportive," I repeated, my voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Is that what you call threatening to socially isolate me if I didn't abandon my career? Is that your definition of support?" Grace's smile never wavered, but I caught the flash of calculation in her eyes. "I think there may have been some miscommunication about our concern. We were simply worried about the stress you seemed to be under, trying to manage what we thought was a struggling small business." Emmy, meanwhile, was approaching the situation with the aggressive intellectual curiosity that had made her successful as a prosecutor. She leaned forward, her Harvard law training evident in the way she began dissecting the evidence I had presented. "I'd like to understand the timeline here," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone cross-examining a witness. "When exactly did you start hiding the true scope of your business from the family? And more importantly, what was your motivation for maintaining such an elaborate deception?" The question was designed to put me on the defensive, to shift the focus from their behavior to mine. But I had been expecting this tactic. "My motivation," I said calmly, "was protecting my achievements from exactly the kind of systematic dismissal I experienced tonight. Every time I shared good news about my business, it was minimized, questioned, or dismissed as unrealistic ambition." Seth joined his sister's interrogation, his federal prosecutor instincts apparently unable to resist the opportunity to probe what he clearly saw as suspicious behavior. "But surely you understand how this looks," he said, gesturing toward the document spread across the table. "You've been living a double life for months, maybe years. How are we supposed to trust someone who's capable of such sustained deception?" The irony was staggering. The same people who had spent the evening systematically humiliating me were now positioning themselves as the victims of my dishonesty. Marco, who had been silent since learning about the acquisition offer, finally found his voice. His words came out in a rush, as if he had been rehearsing them while processing the implications of what I had revealed. "Marianne, honey, I know things got a little heated tonight, but we can work through this," he said, reaching across the table toward my hand. "Maybe we should have been more encouraging about your business, but that doesn't mean we can't start fresh, now that we understand what you've really accomplished." His tone was conciliatory, almost pleading, and I realized that he was already calculating the social and financial implications of being married to someone worth significantly more than his family's law firm. But it was Harriet who delivered the most sophisticated attempt at reconciliation. As a surgeon, she was accustomed to making quick decisions under pressure, and her medical training had taught her the importance of addressing problems directly. "You know, Marianne," she said thoughtfully, "this actually explains a lot about some of the tension we've all been feeling. If you'd been carrying the stress of building such a significant business while feeling like you couldn't share your successes with your family, that must have been incredibly isolating." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "Perhaps we can all agree that better communication might have prevented tonight's misunderstandings." The word misunderstandings was particularly galling, as if 3 years of condescension and tonight's systematic humiliation could be dismissed as simple communication failure. I looked around the table at these people who were now scrambling to reposition themselves as supportive family members who had simply been operating with incomplete information. Their desperation was almost palpable, and for the first time since I had entered this family, I held all the power. But power without purpose is meaningless, and I knew exactly what I intended to do with mine. I let their desperate attempts at reconciliation hang in the air for a long moment, savoring the complete reversal of power dynamics that had taken place in the span of 20 minutes. These people who had spent the evening systematically dismantling my confidence were now scrambling to rebuild bridges they had burned with such casual cruelty. But I was no longer the woman who would accept their conditional acceptance or their revisionist history about tonight's event. "You want to talk about communication?" I said, my voice cutting through their anxious chatter like a blade through silk. "Let me communicate something very clearly to all of you." I stood up slowly, the movement commanding immediate attention from everyone at the table. The documents remained spread before me like evidence in a trial, each piece of paper a testament to the empire I had built while they tried to convince me I was failing. "For 3 years I have bent over backward to earn your respect and accept. I have absorbed your criticism, internalized your doubts, and allowed you to make me question my own worth and capabilities." Grace opened her mouth to interrupt, but I held up a hand that stopped her cold. "I'm not finished," I said, and something in my tone made it clear that the old rules of family hierarchy no longer applied. "Tonight, you all revealed exactly who you are when you think someone has no power to fight back. You're sophisticated, well-educated bullies, but bullies nonetheless." Marco reached toward me again, his face a mask of panic and calculation. "Marianne, please, let's discuss this rationally." "Rationally?" I laughed, and the sound was completely devoid of humor. "Was it rational when you joined your mother in mocking my career instead of defending your wife? Was it rational when you all spent the evening threatening to socially isolate me if I didn't abandon my ambitions?" I began gathering the documents, each movement deliberate and fine. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm accepting Meridian Global's acquisition offer. $12 million, plus a 5-year consulting contract worth an additional $8 million, $20 million total." The numbers hit the room like physical blow. Even Anthony, who had been trying to maintain judicial neutrality, looked stunned by the sheer magnitude of what I was walking away with. "Marianne," Grace said, her voice taking on the pleading tone of someone who had just realized they had catastrophically miscalculated, "surely we can work through this as a family." "There's no need for such drastic family," I interrupted, looking around the table at faces that had shown me nothing but condescension and cruelty. "You've made it very clear that I'm not family. I'm an inconvenience. A social obligation. A charity case that Marco imposed on all of you." I turned to face Marco directly, this man who had promised to honor and protect me but had thrown me to the wolves the moment it became socially convenient. "You have a choice to make, Marco," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who no longer needed anything from him. You can continue to be the kind of man who joins in when his family attacks his wife, or you can decide to be something better. But I'm not waiting around to find out which version of yourself you choose. Emmy, clearly struggling with the legal implications of what was unfolding, leaned forward with the desperate intensity of someone trying to salvage a losing case. You can't just walk away from a marriage because of one difficult conversation, she said. There are legal considerations, financial entanglements. Actually, I said with a smile that was all sharp edges. I can. The prenup that your family insisted I sign, the one that was supposed to protect the Blackstone assets from my gold-digging tendencies. It works both ways. My business assets are completely separate from any marital property claim. I could see Seth doing the mental calculations, his prosecutor's mind working through the implications of a prenup that had been designed to protect the family from me, but now protected my much larger fortune from them. Plus, I continued, given that my company was built entirely through my own efforts using my own resources and operated under my maiden name, there's absolutely no basis for any community property claims. The legal reality of the situation was sinking in. Not only had they systematically humiliated someone with significantly more wealth than their entire family, but they had no legal recourse to claim any portion of that wealth. Grace made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Darling, you're upset, and rightfully so. But making permanent decisions based on one evening's misunderstanding. Misunderstanding, I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. 3 years of condescension was a misunderstanding. Tonight's ultimatum was a misunderstanding. Your threats to socially isolate me were misunderstandings. I closed the folder with a sound that seemed to echo through the silent room, like a gavel falling. Let me be absolutely clear about the new rules, I said, my voice carrying across the dining room with crystalline precision. I don't need your money, your connections, or your social approval. I am independently wealthy, professionally successful, and personally done with all of you. The silence that followed was profound and complete. For the first time in the history of the Blackstone family, someone had rejected them entirely, walked away from their world with more power and resources than they possessed themselves. The woman who begged for your acceptance is gone, I said, heading toward the door. In her place is someone who knows her worth and won't settle for anything less than she deserves. The weeks that followed that dinner were a masterclass in how quickly life can change when you stop seeking approval from people who were never going to give it to you. Moving out of the Blackstone mansion had taken exactly 1 day. A testament to how little I had actually accumulated during 3 years of trying to fit into a world that had never wanted me. My real life, it turned out, had been waiting for me in the secret office across town that none of them had ever seen. The space that had once felt like a hideout now became my headquarters, the command center for a business empire that was about to expand in ways I had never imagined possible. The Meridian Global acquisition moved forward with remarkable speed. Patricia Daniels had been impressed not just by my technology, but by my strategic thinking and business acumen. During our final negotiation meeting, she had made an observation that crystallized everything I had been feeling. You know, Marianne, she had said, reviewing the acquisition documents in the conference room overlooking the city, most entrepreneurs struggle with the transition from small business to major corporation. But you've been operating at enterprise level while maintaining the agility of a startup. That's extraordinarily rare. I had smiled at the compliment, realizing that this was the first time in years that someone had praised my business skills without qualifying it with surprise or condescension. Patricia didn't care about my background or my social connections. She cared about results, innovation, and the bottom line. It was refreshing to be valued for what I actually brought to the table. The financial independence that came with the acquisition was life-changing, but not in the way I had expected. It wasn't about the luxury or the security, though both were certainly welcome. It was about the freedom to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I needed or what others expected of me. I had purchased a sleek downtown condominium with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. The space was modern, efficient, and entirely mine. No family heirlooms to work around, no social expectations to fulfill, no inherited furniture that carried the weight of generations of Blackstone judgment. But the most significant change wasn't external. It was internal. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space at family dinners had been replaced by someone who commanded boardrooms with quiet confidence. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was more like finally allowing my true self to emerge after years of suppression. My first major decision as Meridian Global's newest senior consultant had been to establish a mentorship program for women entrepreneurs. I understood better than most how isolating it could be to build something significant while surrounded by people who were invested in keeping you small. The program launched with a $500,000 endowment from my personal funds, and the response had been overwhelming. Within a month, I was working with 12 women who were building revolutionary businesses in everything from biotech to sustainable manufacturing. Watching their progress reminded me daily of why I had fought so hard to protect my own success. These women were brilliant, innovative, and determined, but they were also navigating the same subtle undermining that I had experienced. The difference was that now they had support from someone who understood their struggle and had the resources to actually help. My relationship status had been the subject of considerable speculation in the city's social circle. Marco had made several attempts to reach out, his messages oscillating between apologies and attempts to negotiate some kind of reconciliation. I had read each one carefully, looking for any sign that he understood the fundamental nature of what had gone wrong between us. The messages revealed a man who was genuinely regretful but still fundamentally unable to comprehend why I had found their behavior unacceptable. He apologized for the dinner being uncomfortable and suggested that we could work through our communication issues with counsel. He had even mentioned that his family was willing to be more supportive of my business now that they understood its scope. But nowhere in his carefully crafted emails did he acknowledge that the problem wasn't communication. It was he couldn't see that their willingness to support my business now that it was financially successful only proved how conditional their acceptance had always been. I had responded to his final message with a single paragraph that laid out the situation with legal precision. Marco, I appreciate your apologies, but I think you misunderstand the nature of what happened that evening. The issue wasn't that your family didn't know about my success, it was that they felt entitled to mock and belittle what they thought was my failure. Their current willingness to accept me is based entirely on my net worth, which proves that their previous rejection was based on their perception of my lack of value. I cannot build a life with someone who sees my worth as conditional on external validation. The divorce papers had been filed under my maiden name, processed through an attorney who specialized in high net worth separations. The prenup that the Blackstones had insisted upon worked exactly as they had intended, protecting my business assets completely while ensuring a clean break with no ongoing financial entanglements. For the first time in my adult life, I was answerable only to myself, and the freedom was intoxicating. 1 year after that transformative dinner, I stood in the penthouse conference room of Meridian Global's headquarters, looking out at a city that had once felt like a maze designed to keep me lost. Now it spread before me like a map of possibilities, each building representing potential partnerships, new ventures, and opportunities that I was finally free to pursue on my own terms. The woman reflected in the floor-to-ceiling windows bore little resemblance to the one who had once desperately arranged dinner parties to win the approval of people who were never going to give it. This version of myself wore confidence like a perfectly tailored suit, carried authority without apology, and commanded respect through competence rather than pleading for it through compliance. The mentorship program had evolved beyond anything I had initially envisioned. What started as support for 12 women entrepreneurs had grown into a foundation that provided funding, resources, and strategic guidance to over 200 female-founded businesses across the country. The ripple effect was extraordinary. Each successful business created jobs, generated innovation, and proved that women could build empires when given the tools and support they deserved. My sister Rachel had become the foundation's director of operations, her nonprofit experience and unwavering belief in ambitious women making her perfect for the role. Watching her flourish in a position where her talents were not just recognized but celebrated reminded me daily of why I had fought so hard to escape a world that demanded I diminish myself to fit their expectations. The social circles that had once seemed so important now felt like distant memories from someone else's life. The charity galas, country club events, and carefully orchestrated dinner parties that Grace had insisted were essential to my happiness had been replaced by industry conferences, innovation summits, and boardroom meetings where my voice carried weight because of what I knew rather than who I was married to. Patricia Daniels had become more than a business partner. She had become a friend and mentor who understood the unique challenges of building something significant in a world that often preferred women to remain decorative rather than powerful. Our monthly strategy sessions had evolved into genuine conversations about leadership, innovation, and the responsibility that came with success. You know, she had said during our most recent meeting, when I first approached you about the acquisition, I was impressed by your technology. But watching you build the foundation and expand your influence, that's when I realized we hadn't just acquired a company, we'd gained a visionary. The Blackstone family had faded into irrelevance with surprising speed. Occasionally I would hear updates through mutual acquaintances. Marco had been dating someone from their social circle, a young attorney whose family had the right connections and appropriate expectations. Grace continued to hold court at charity events, no doubt weaving stories about her son's unfortunate first marriage to explain away my conspicuous absence from their world. Emmy had apparently made partner at her firm ahead of schedule, while Seth had received the federal appointment he had been pursuing. Their successes felt distant and unimportant, like news from a country I had once visited but no longer remembered clearly. The most telling development had come 6 months earlier, when Anthony had reached out through intermediaries to see if I might be interested in consulting on a major case involving corporate efficiency standards. The irony was exquisite. The family that had dismissed my expertise was now hoping to benefit from it professionally. I had declined politely but firmly, not out of spite but because I had more important work to do with people who had never questioned my capability. My personal life had found its own rhythm, built around genuine connections rather than social obligation. The women in my mentorship program had become a chosen family of sorts. Brilliant and driven individuals who understood the cost of building something meaningful while surrounded by people invested in your failure. There was someone new in my life. Elena Rodriguez, a biotech entrepreneur whose revolutionary cancer treatment research was being funded through my foundation. Our relationship had developed naturally from professional respect to personal connection, built on the kind of mutual admiration that had been completely absent from my marriage to Marco. Elena understood ambition because she supported my work because she valued its impact, not because it reflected well on her social status. When she looked at me, she saw a partner and an equal, not a social project that needed improvement or management. The 3-year anniversary of that dinner approached without fanfare or reflection on my part. I had moved so far beyond the woman who had sat at that table, desperate for acceptance from people who would never give it, that the memory felt like something from a movie I had watched long ago. But sometimes when I was working late in my office overlooking the city, I would remember the moment when I had stood up from that dining room table and walked toward the truth that would set me free. That moment had changed everything. Not just my circumstances, but my understanding of my own worth. The woman who had begged for scraps of respect was gone, replaced by someone who knew that respect, like love, could never be earned through submission. It had to be demanded, defended, and sometimes fought for with everything you had. And I had won. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.